The biting late autumn wind in Chicago howled like a hungry wolf around the small apartment. The old windows banged against their frames, allowing slivers of icy air to enter and make the interior temperature almost as hostile as the exterior. Aisha pulled her thin shawl, a relic from a distant time and place, tighter over her shoulders. The fabric, once vibrant with the colors of her native Kabul, was now faded and worn, just like her smile. Her eyes, the color of ripe almonds, lingered on her 6-year-old daughter Zara, who slept curled up under a pile of blankets on a mattress on the floor. It was the only piece of furniture in the room, besides a small oil heater that spat out inconsistent heat and smelled of burning. Each of Zara's breaths formed a small white cloud in the air. Aisha sat beside her, her trembling hand stroking the girl's ebony black hair. Pain was a constant companion, a dull sting in her back from carrying boxes in a warehouse for 12 hours straight, a weight on her chest from counting the few bills left in the glass jar. It was $237. The $700 rent was due in 5 days. Fear was a familiar taste in her mouth, metallic and bitter, like the water running from a rusty tap. She remembered the noise of the helicopters, the dust rising to the sky like a brown veil, her husband Farrick's face disappearing into the desperate crowd at Kabul airport. A black hole opened up inside her whenever that memory visited her in the quiet hours. Here in America, she was invisible. A shadow moving between the exhausting work and the struggle to keep her daughter warm and fed. No one saw her. No one would notice if she simply disappeared. Zara turned in her sleep, murmuring something in Dari. "Mom, is it snowing inside the house?" Aisha swallowed her tears. "No, Jana, my love," she whispered, kissing her daughter's cold forehead. "Dream of the sun. Dream of a warm place." She stood, her bones creaking with exhaustion, and went to the window. The street was deserted, lit by streetlights that cast puddles of pale orange light onto the wet asphalt. The houses across the street looked like fortresses, with their warm lights and drawn curtains. Untouchable worlds. She watched a man huddled inside a worn coat, sitting on the steps of the entrance to the building next door, an empty commercial building. He was there every day in the same position, like a statue of despair. She felt a pang of recognition. He was invisible too. The clock on the cheap phone screen showed 11:17 p.m. Another night of sleep fragmented by anxiety. Another day ahead that seemed like an insurmountable mountain. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. Invisibility was her prison, but Zara was the key that kept her anchored. She had to survive. She had to find a spark of hope in the midst of that ice. The phone alarm rang at 4:30 a.m., a shrill sound that cut through the darkness like a knife. Aisha was already awake, her body aching from the previous night on the thin mattress. She moved in the dark, a silent and efficient ritual. He put on the same trousers and the same wool sweater, washed in the sink until they were rough. He prepared Zara's breakfast, slightly hard bread with a thin layer of peanut butter and an apple. He wrote a note in Dari. "Eat everything, my light. Aunt Layla will come to pick you up for school. I love you more than all the stars." Aunt Layla was another Syrian refugee from the floor below, a quid pro quo that kept his daughters alive. The journey to the storeroom was a test of endurance. 2 buses, with a 15-minute wait in a glass shelter that offered little protection from the glacial wind. Inside the warehouse, the world was a choreography of metal shelves, fluorescent lights, and the constant roar of forklifts. Aisha was a picker. A device on her wrist dictated her movements, a robotic voice ordering her to pick the next item. It was an inhuman job, turning people into extensions of an algorithm. The hours dragged on, marked only by the growing pain in her back and the hunger that began to gnaw at her stomach. Around her, tired faces, mostly immigrants like her, avoided eye contact, each trapped in their own struggle for survival. During her 30-minute break, she sat alone in a corner of the break room, eating the sandwich she had brought. That's when she saw him. The man from the empty building. He was in line to buy coffee from the machine, his trembling hands rummaging through his empty pockets. He wore a thin coat and a worn wool hat. His face was marked by a life of hardship, deep-set eyes that seemed to have given up on seeing anything good. He tripped over his own feet, and the little change he managed to find, a few cents, fell and rolled across the dirty floor. He knelt, disoriented, and Aisha saw his shoulders slump in a mixture of shame and despair. No one in the busy room seemed to notice. No one cared. It was like looking at a reflection of herself, a possible future. A sharp pain, different from physical pain, tightened in Aisha's chest. She thought of the glass jar, the $700 in rent, the uncertainty of tomorrow. Each dollar was a nail holding her fragile boat afloat. But looking at that man, at his silent defeat, was unbearable. Before she could rationalize, before fear overwhelmed her, her legs moved. She stood up, approached him, and without saying a word, placed her own wrapped sandwich, her only meal until the end of her shift, in the man's calloused hand. Then he knelt, picked up the scattered cents, and pressed the cold coins into his palm. Their eyes met. His, a storm of surprise and confusion. Hers, filled with painful empathy. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Aisha merely shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that said, "It's not necessary. I understand." She turned and returned to her post, her stomach rumbling, but her heart inexplicably lighter. There was no heroism in her gesture, only raw recognition. They were ghosts, but in that brief moment they saw each other. The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of regret and a strange spark of peace. As she packed endless boxes, Aisha's mind was a battlefield. What had she done? That sandwich was a meal she wouldn't have. The hunger she felt now was real, a physical and debilitating sensation. Zara needed dinner. She would have to stretch the lentil soup to its limit, fill the pot with more water so the broth would go further. The voice on her wrist seemed more urgent, more critical. Every second counted, and she had wasted her time and her food on a stranger. Guilt was a heavy weight. But then, she remembered the man's eyes. That flash of disbelief, the ice of humiliation melting for an instant. She knew that feeling. She knew the crushing loneliness of being ignored. Perhaps, she thought, a single act of recognition, however small, was worth more than a meal. The inner battle was exhausting. By the end of her shift, her legs trembled with tiredness and hunger. The drive home was a blur. She picked up Zara from Layla, forcing a smile for her daughter, who was jumping up and down excitedly to tell her about her day at school. "Mom, I learned a new word. 星号, butterfly 星号. It's so pretty." Aisha hugged her daughter, feeling the small, fragile bones beneath her coat. "It's beautiful, Janam," she whispered, her voice hoarse. At home, while the soup simmered on the single-burner stove, she counted the money again. $237. The rent loomed over her like a precipice. Zara, sensing her mother's mood, sat quietly, coloring on a piece of paper with worn-out crayons. "Mom, are you sad?" the girl asked, her big eyes full of worry. "No, my light," Aisha lied, kneeling to hug her. "Mom's just tired." That night, after putting Zara to bed, she stood by the window again. The stairway of the building next door was empty. A pang of worry, irrational and profound, surged within her. Where was he? Was he all right? She scolded herself. He was a stranger. Her own life was on the verge of collapse. But the image of that small exchange, that moment of shared humanity amidst the coldness of the warehouse, warmed her in a way that the oil heater never could. It was a small, flickering flame, but it was hers. She hadn't solved his problems, and he certainly wouldn't solve hers. But for one night, the fear of being completely invisible seemed to recede a few inches. She picked up the faded shawl and pulled it to smell the fabric. It smelled of dust and memories. For the first time in many months, it didn't just smell of despair. There was a thread of hope, as thin as a hair, woven into the weave. The following morning arrived with the same brutal routine, but the gray sky seemed a little less heavy. Aisha dressed, prepared Zara's breakfast, and went out to face the cold. The wait at the bus shelter was particularly painful, with a damp wind that penetrated to the bone. She kept her head down, her hands deep in her pockets, counting the minutes. When the bus finally arrived, crowded and smelling of damp clothes and coffee, she found a place near the window, and rested her forehead against the cold glass. The world outside passed by in a stream of gray and white. She tried not to think about the man. Tried not to think about the rent. She focused only on her breathing, on the swaying of the bus. The shift at the warehouse began as always. The voice on her pulse, the endless shelves, the pain that settled in like a second skin. During her break, she avoided the break room, staying instead in the loading area, eating the single apple she had brought. She didn't see him. Part of her was relieved. Another part, inexplicably, was disappointed. The day dragged on. When the final signal sounded, releasing them, a wave of relief washed over her. All she wanted was to pick up Zara, go home and sleep. The second bus was late. She stopped at the shelter, tapping her feet on the ground to warm them, exhaustion weighing on every cell of her body. It was then that a strange feeling overwhelmed her. The feeling of being watched. Not in a threatening way, but intense. She looked up through the fogged glass of the shelter. Across the street, standing beside a sleek black Jeep, was a man. He wore an expensive coat, a dark gray that matched his hair with a few gray streaks. He wasn't looking at his phone, nor at the traffic. He was looking directly at her. His eyes were sharp, clear and focused. Aisha felt a chill run down her spine. It was the same man she had occasionally seen at the warehouse, not as a worker, but as someone observing operations. He had always seemed distant, an unattainable authority figure. Why was he looking at her? Her heart began to pound, a drum of fear in her chest. She quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the scarf on her head. When she glanced back, he was still looking. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips before he turned, got into the Jeep and drove off. The bus arrived and Aisha got on, confused and frightened. Why her? What had she done? Was it because of the sandwich man? Was it an infraction? Would they fire her? Panic set in, clouding her exhaustion. She could barely breathe. Invisibility had been her protection. Now she had been seen, and that terrified her. The next day was Saturday. Zara slept in late, a small miracle that allowed Aisha to clean the tiny apartment with a damp cloth and prepare naan on an old griddle. The sun struggled to penetrate the thick clouds, casting a pale, diffuse light across the room. Aisha still felt uneasy about the incident with the man in the Jeep. She tried to convince herself it had been her imagination, a product of tiredness. Perhaps he was just looking at the bus schedule behind her. Perhaps the smile wasn't for her. She was setting the table for breakfast when a firm, decisive knock on the door echoed through the small space. Aisha's heart stopped. No one knocked on her door. Layla usually shouted from the stairs. The landlord only left notices under the door. Zara raised her head, her eyes wide. "Mom, who is it?" Aisha shook her head, putting a finger to her lips. She approached the door, her body tense. She looked through the peephole. Outside, in the dimly lit hallway, stood two men. One was the man from the Jeep, the one in the expensive coat. He seemed even more imposing up close, his posture erect and confident. The other was a younger man, wearing a suit, holding a briefcase. Aisha felt her legs go weak. It was the landlord. He had come to evict her. He had brought a lawyer. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She recoiled, leaning against the wall, closing her eyes. Zara rushed to her, embracing her leg. "Mother!" The knocking repeated, softer this time. "Mrs. Aisha?" Was the younger man's voice. She had no choice. With a trembling hand, she unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, pulling Zara behind her, protecting her. The younger man spoke. "Mrs. Aisha? My name is David. And this is Mr. Alistair Croft." The man in the Jeep, Alistair Croft, tilted his head slightly. His eyes weren't hard. They swept down the corridor past her, to the small space behind, seeing the mattress on the floor, the oil heater, the desolate simplicity of her life. But there was no judgment in his gaze. There was something more. Curiosity? Perhaps pity. "Good morning," said Croft, his voice surprisingly soft, a deep melody that contrasted with the surroundings. "May we come in for a moment? We'd like to speak with you." Aisha could only nod, stepping aside to let them in. The two men entered, making the small space seem even smaller. Zara hid her face in her mother's dress. Aisha felt exposed, her raw, naked poverty under the gaze of those men. The end had come. David, the younger man, closed the door gently. Alistair Croft remained standing, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes still scanning the room with thoughtful intensity. He paused at one of Zara's drawings, taped to the wall, a bright yellow sun over a green house. "That's a beautiful drawing," he commented, his voice breaking the tense silence. Aisha said nothing, her arms still around Zara. David cleared his throat. "Mrs. Aisha, Mr. Croft owns Croft Logistics, the company that manages the warehouse where you work." Aisha felt a knot tighten in her stomach. It was worse than she thought. He wasn't just the landlord, he was her boss. She had certainly done something terribly wrong. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice faltering. "What did I do? Please don't fire me. I have my daughter." Alistair Croft turned to face her directly. His face was serious. "You're not fired, Aisha. Quite the opposite." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have a security camera system throughout the warehouse. Not just for security, but to observe operations. To observe people." He paused, and his eyes locked with hers with a force that made her want to recoil. "I saw what you did the day before yesterday. In the break room. With the man, Joseph, the homeless man who usually stays in the building next door." Aisha froze. He had seen her give him her sandwich. Would they reprimand her for wasting time? For interacting with an intruder? Tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of fear and shame. He looked hungry," she stammered, feeling incredibly foolish. Croft shook his head, and for the first time, a genuine, though small, smile lit up his face. "Yes. He was. And you, who clearly don't have much, gave him the only thing you had at that moment." He stepped forward. "Aisha, I built my company from scratch. I see hundreds of people every day. I see people working for a salary. I see people working to climb the career ladder. But it's rare, very rare, to see someone work with such dignity in a difficult situation. And even rarer to see an act of pure, selfless kindness. Especially when it costs so much." He looked around again, and his gaze stopped on Zara's frightened face. "That act, Aisha, told me more about your character than any resume or period of experience ever could." David opened his briefcase and took out a white envelope. "Mr. Croft would like to offer you this." Aisha stared at the envelope as if it were a snake. She didn't reach out to take it. Croft understood. "It's not a letter of dismissal. It's an opportunity." David handed the envelope to Aisha. Her hands trembled violently as she finally took it. It was heavy. Too heavy to be just paper. She looked at Croft, seeking confirmation. He nodded, encouraging her. With clumsy fingers, she opened the envelope's flap and peered inside. What she saw made the air escape her lungs. They weren't documents. They were wads of bills. American dollars. Lots of them. Many more than she had ever seen in her life. At the top of the pile was a single check, with her name written on it. The amount made her eyes widen. $50,000. She looked up, her mind refusing to process. What is this?" she whispered, her voice a mere whisper. "It's a start, Aisha," Croft said calmly. "The check is a bonus. Recognition of your character. The money in the envelope is for immediate expenses." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But there's more. My company needs people with integrity. People who understand the value of loyalty and compassion. I'm offering you a new position. Supervisor of a new humanitarian logistics team, focused on helping non-profit organizations. The salary is double what you earn now. And there's an education fund for Zara." Aisha looked at him, then at the money, then at Zara's confused face. This wasn't real. It was a dream. A dangerous dream from which she would wake up at any moment, back in her icy reality. Tears began to roll down her face, silent and hot. She couldn't stop them. "Why?" was all she could say. Croft stepped forward, his voice low and sincere. "Because this world is a hard and cold place, Aisha. And for every act of cruelty we see, we need to remember that there are also acts of light. Your act was one of those lights for me. It was a lesson in humanity on an ordinary day. And the world and my company need more of that. He looked at Zara. Your daughter deserves to see that kindness can have good consequences. And you deserve a chance to show what you're capable of, without having to fight just to survive. Aisha fell to her knees on the floor, the envelope pressed against her chest. She couldn't speak. Sobs shook her body, a torrent of repressed emotions, years of fear, of pain, of invisibility, to be washed away by a wave of overwhelming relief and disbelief. Zara, startled, knelt beside her, embracing her. Mom, don't cry. Is everything all right? Aisha hugged her daughter, burying her face in her hair. Yes, Janam, she cried, her tears wetting Zara's hair. For the first time, everything is all right. The days that followed were a waking dream. Aisha used some of the money to pay the rent months in advance, and bought a decent mattress for herself and Zara. The first night they slept on a soft, warm bed was a revelation. She bought Zara a warm, waterproof coat in a bright red color that the girl loved. With David's guidance, she rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, with central heating and windows that kept out the wind. The move was completed in a weekend, with the help of Layla, who cried tears of joy with her friend. The new job was a different world. Instead of the deafening noise of the warehouse, she had a small room. Instead of a robotic voice on her wrist, she had a team of 5 people she coordinated, organizing the delivery of medical supplies and food to shelters and refugee centers. She knew the need. She understood the logistics of desperation. Her team respected her, not out of fear, but because she led with the same compassion that had brought her there. Alistair Croft occasionally stopped by to see how she was doing. He wasn't a friend, but a mentor. A man who had seen a rough diamond in the darkness, and decided to polish its facets. One day, he told her about Joseph, the homeless man. Croft had offered him a job as a caretaker in the commercial building that was being renovated, and connected him with addiction support services. You didn't save him, Aisha, Croft said. But you were the catalyst. You reminded me that behind every statistic, there is a person. Aisha sat at her new desk, looking out the window at the city that no longer seemed so hostile. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. And being seen, she realized, wasn't about being noticed by the powerful. It was about her actions, her character, having an impact on the world. She began to wear her faded shawl no longer out of necessity, but as a reminder. A reminder of where she came from, and of the power of a single gesture, made from the heart, in the midst of one's own struggle. 6 months later, spring arrived in Chicago. The air was still crisp, but the sun had a genuine warmth, and stubborn green buds were beginning to appear on the tree branches. Aisha and Zara were in their new apartment. There were books on the shelf. Toys scattered around the living room. It smelled of bologna, a fried dough that Aisha was teaching Zara to make, a recipe from her own mother. Life wasn't perfect. Aisha still had nightmares. The longing for Farik, whose whereabouts remained a painful mystery, was a wound that never fully healed. But the daily struggle for survival was over. She hadn't just survived, she had now thrived. Zara was in a good school, learning English at an astonishing pace and making friends. Her teacher said she was becoming more talkative, more confident. That Saturday afternoon, as they were cleaning the flour from the table, someone knocked on the door. It was a delivery man, holding a small package. For Lady Aisha and Zara, he said. It was a gift from Croft. Inside, there were 2 season passes to the Lincoln Park Zoo and a storybook in Dari and English. There was also a note. To create new happy memories. BC. Zara picked up the book, her eyes shining. He remembers us, Mom. Aisha smiled, a deep and peaceful sense of gratitude filling her. Yes, my light. He remembers. She looked out the window of her kitchen, at the city that was now her home. She thought of the long and painful journey from Kabul, through the refugee camps, in the cold of her first apartment. Kindness hadn't erased those memories, nor healed all the wounds. But it had built a bridge over the abyss of her despair. It had shown her that her humanity, far from being a weakness, was her greatest strength. She was no longer the invisible refugee. She was Aisha, survivor, mother, and now, a beacon of hope, not only for herself and her daughter, but for all those whose lives she touched through her new work. Her story was proof that even the smallest spark of compassion could ignite a miraculous turnaround, proving that in a sometimes dark world, no one is truly alone or beyond the reach of the light. Summer brought a vibrant heat to the city, and with it, a new sense of purpose for Aisha. She saw herself not only as a recipient of a miraculous gift, but as a link in a chain. She began using part of her salary to buy extra groceries on the weekend, which she and Zara packed into small packages. On Sundays, they went to a park near their old neighborhood, where a small community of homeless people gathered. She didn't hand out alms, she shared food and talked. She knew their names: Mrs. Gable, who had lost her job; Mark, a veteran with PTSD; young Chloe. Zara, initially shy, began to run and play with the other children who were sometimes with their parents. One Sunday, Alistair Croft appeared at the park. He said nothing, just stood at a distance, watching Aisha interact with people, with the same dignity and respect she had always possessed. He saw Zara sharing her crayons with a little girl, drawing together in the cement. Later, he approached. "You could just forget," he said, his voice low. "You have your new life." Aisha looked at him, the summer sun illuminating her face, which was no longer so marked by weariness. "Forget what it's like to feel invisible?" she asked. "That I could never do, Mr. Croft. Your gift didn't just lift me up. It gave me the platform to lift others. That's what it means to me." Croft nodded, a deep respect in his eyes. He realized that his investment had yielded interest that far exceeded profit. It had triggered a virtuous cycle of kindness. Aisha had realized that true transformation wasn't about escaping her old life, but about using her newfound strength to illuminate the dark corners she knew so well. She was repaying his gift forward, not in dollars, but in compassion. The stream continued. And for each person in the park who received a food package from her hands, she wasn't just an Afghan woman. It was a face. It was a name. It was a reminder that hope, however fragile it may seem, can always, always, rise from the ashes of despair.